Well, welcome today to the fourth episode in the series, People, Planet, and Performance from Africa to the World. My name is Taiwo Afolabi, and I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to have created this and also to be hosting this. I am dialing in today from the territories of the Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, the home and also the homeland of the Mischief Nation. In fact, it is the University of Regina, where the Center for Social Engaged Theater is located. Is located on these territories, and this is in like 4 weeks. I've not actually been in this space because I've been doing a lot of traveling. So I'm really grateful to be in this space, the center space, and be doing this today. We have had 3 episodes, and today we're focusing on responses to climate crisis and emergencies, storytelling from the performing arts. Last week we had an interesting, amazing conversation with Adam Mapo and Mamuf Plum Harriet Abla Atjaho. I hope I did pronounce that correctly. On retooling green tools for theater in Africa, insights from practitioners. And both of them did talk about their practice and how the issues of climate crisis are something we need to think about, but also specifically that we need to think globally, but we need to start acting locally and personally. Previously to that, we had Jehoshaphat Philip Saber at Ogutu Maraya. On eco-theater, we focused on decolonizing the colonized narrative. And I think a key question that came out of that conversation was that what are those things, the practices that have been handed over to us or passed down to us, and we need to start questioning them. Why are things the way they are? Why are they not different? And then the first episode with myself and Aliyah Kasam was environmental theater and climate justice in Africa. Both of us were looking at how did we get here and how do we move forward? Particularly, we focused on the idea that all these issues are not peculiar to now. They're also not peculiar to the Western world. The only challenge is that it is now that is sort of getting to the attention of the Western world. So we were really interested and we focused on some of those things that even our forefathers, our ancestors, were really thinking about. And a big thing that came out of that, at least for me, is that we need to start thinking that we're the ancestors of the future. So today, myself with Anna Maria Nabier, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Emma Blake Morsi. We're going to be focusing today on responses to climate crisis and emergencies. And they're going to be sharing stories from the performing arts, particularly from their practice. And I'm really looking forward to having this chat with them. These series would not be possible without the support of our partners. So thanks to HowlRound for creating the platform to be able to share some of these thoughts. Thanks to the Center for Sustainable Practices for the Arts, who is our partner, and the Center for Socially Engaged Theater at the University of Regina, and of course, Theater Hemisphere International, our theater partner. So thank you to all of them. And thanks to Flor Gomez. She's been the glue, they've been the glue that hold us together, really managing us and managing the entire project effectively and efficiently, I must say. So I have to put a very quick publicity for Flor right there. So if you're looking to hire someone that is, okay, I'm going to stop that. Okay. But they are doing a fantastic job. That's what I'm trying to say. And of course, thanks to Thier and to our ASL interpreter, Tania, and of course, Victor. With that, I will want to pass it on to Anna Maria and Emma to quickly introduce themselves, where they're from, what they're doing, and all of that, and their connection to our conversation today. So, Anna Maria, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here, really excited to have this conversation. I am currently based in a small town called St Leonard's, which is on the south coast of England in the UK. I was born in London and I'm from Uganda. I'm a multidisciplinary artist and really embracing all the hyphenates here. So I trained as an actor and sort of started off in theatre and performance in a quite traditional, quite British traditional way. And then through my journey as an artist have moved into working in much more sort of expanded ways. So working as a visual artist, as a writer and a director, as an activist, a space maker, an educator, working in community, working in fashion and making, in filmmaking, and yeah, so basically most of the hyphenates. So for me, I'm really excited about like really getting to the core of a story or something, or an issue, or and then seeing what art form is most feels most right to kind of explore that and to tell that story. And I have a very collaborative practice, so then building and working with lots of other artists and creatives to kind of build a team so that we have the skills to go in that direction. I'm really excited about amplifying the stories of marginalized folks, in particular Black women in the diaspora. And at the moment, I've really preoccupied with care and joy within that space. So that's kind of a little snapshot into me.
Thank you so much. Emma?
Thank you. Oh, this is so lovely. Hi, everyone. I'm Emma Blake Morsi. I'm also dialing in from the UK in Bristol. Lovely, rainy day outside, looking out the window. I guess a bit of an AD description. I'm a Black woman with a gold-rimmed glasses, and I have a weird interest in hairstyle at the moment. I've got 2 buns and 2 plaits, black hair, and an interesting white background with 2 kind of photography pieces that I call nature traits, which have a physical silhouette and like a floral head. But ultimately, I'm super excited to be here. I've got kind of over a decade working in the creative industry, specifically as an award-winning multidisciplinary arts producer. A lot of my work kind of stems in different areas, which I'll talk about in a second. But I'm also a production and partnerships manager for Enviral, which is a sustainability campaigns agency, as well as a non-exec director for Rise and Arts Agency. I used to be a former Bristol City Council's culture board member. Ultimately, a lot of what I do is kind of being a prolific storyteller, working across a lot of different mediums, from film to photography, writing, design, events and sound. And a lot of what I've been doing is kind of being informed by my training in creative intersectional environmentalism for a lot of years in STEM, so stuff like science, technology, engineering and math. But I did lots of research across different elements, so looking into how to develop sustainable circular systems and repurposing waste substances, to using experimental hybrid technology and tools to provide inclusive nature-inspired experiences and performances, as well as production managing some inspiring up to 6-figure environmentally conscious AdGreen productions, and also Nigerian born but predominantly raised in Bristol. And I've loved delivering a lot of my international projects and creative public engagement across from the Middle East to America and Africa and Europe. Previously used to live in Germany as well. And I guess ultimately a lot of the work that I do, and I'm mostly renowned for work that kind of challenges our approaches to inclusion and innovation, producing a lot of research-informed projects that can be experienced by all or tailored for varied audiences, but most importantly for me, gives visibility to and engages those from marginalized groups. So yeah, super excited to talk some more about this topic because it's definitely the realm of all that I love to do.
Yeah, thank you. We have 2 amazing award-winning artists today, and in this episode, And of course, previous episode we've had, it's the same. And again, when I was thinking about this and curating the sessions, for me, part of the intention is to we want to take all this discourse away from academic, and it's not as if academic is not useful. I sit in the academia and also as an artist, but how can we take all of this knowledge and start hearing really not just only the lived experience, but the living experience? How can we weave all of that together? So thank you both for coming today. What I try to do in every of the episode is to shout out to one or two, initiatives on the continent or elsewhere that are focusing on the works on the continent around climate issues and the focus of this series. And today I'd like to do a shout out to a magazine. And really all my shout out has kind of been from individual to organization to initiative. So today I'm doing just one shout out to Lacuna magazine. It's actually based out of the UK, and they have a particular chapter, I would say, they call it current, and they highlighted 9 African artists using their art for climate activism. It's open, I believe it's open source. Anybody can see it online, and it was actually published June 1st, 2022. At least that's the date that is on that particular site. Once again, it's called Lacuna magazine, and specifically I think the section is on environment, and the reason why I had to bring that to give a shout out to them, and the people, or my shout out, I don't know them, so just a disclaimer. It's just based on my own research and look at the work that people are doing. It's just really interesting to start shining light on things. Now, the first time I stumbled on that particular page, I wasn't aware of most actually of the artists that were actually on that page, and what that speaks to me also is the level of invisibility of many works that artists on the continent or from the continent that are working on all these kind of issues that we don't really get to hear about them. So for me, I'm really thinking about places on the margin. For example, when we talk about Africa, as much as we want to think about Nigeria, and I am from Nigeria, I love my country, it's great. Anytime, any day, I love it. But do we want to think about Rwanda? Do we want to think about the Gambia? Do we want to think about Burundi? There are other spaces that we don't necessarily think about them like we think about some other spaces. And so for me, I really appreciate that kind of initiative. And so my provocation in regards to that is, I want us to start thinking locally too. What are, as artists in our work as researchers and connectors and facilitators, what are those practices and artists and communities and initiatives that we need to start amplifying, so that as we speak about our work, which is great, we also want to start bringing those initiatives along. And maybe we can also recommend them to possibilities and opportunities. I'll leave it at that. So really my shout out today is the Lacuna magazine, and thank you for that chapter on environment, chapter 9, and they're featuring 9 artists from the continent that are working on climate, using their art to really challenge issues of climate, to really talk about issues of climate activism. And I believe that there are many more initiatives like that. So I'm just using these as a connection to every other initiatives that look like that. So thank you so much. In case our audience viewers, whether right now or later, you have anyone or any artist, community, practice, or organizations or initiatives on the continent or from the continent, or that are not situated on the continent, but they are doing work that has to do with climate issues, activism on the continent of Africa, and you want us to give them a shout out in the remaining 3 episodes, please send it our way. We'll be happy to do that. With that, I would like to pass it on to Anna and Maria again. Both Anna Maria and Emma are going to be doing a short excerpt from some of their work. We had a lovely chat yesterday, so I'm really looking forward to the excerpt, the presentation they're going to making in regards to their work, because we also want to bring a lot of creativity, a lot of art into this conversation. So over to both of you.
Okay, I will start. So I was going to show a video of a piece of work that I have been making and continue to make, but then I don't know, I decided to kind of describe it, to write a piece of writing that's a bit of an audio description of what the performance was, because it felt like the performance was much more in person than necessarily a video piece. And so I thought that this is another way of sharing that experience rather than looking at film. So it's from a piece of work called The Story of Joy, and I'll go. So we are in a large studio with wooden floors and white walls. Along one of the walls are a series of white blocks and plinths. They're about 1.5 to 2 meters in length and 1 meter wide. Some are upright and some are horizontal. They are close together, forming a white on white landscape. The curtains of the room are closed, so the lighting is dark. On one of the plinths, there is a desk lamp and a glass jar with a lid. We cannot see its contents. A tall black woman walks into the space. She is thick. She has a short, tight afro. She wears a lesu, a wrapper, a katenga, a kanga, many names, many patterns, many uses. It's wrapped around her body, under her armpits, across her chest, and across her back. There are drips of water glistening in the blackness of her hair, forming drops of water on her neck and on her back. She sits near the lamp and jar, on one of the white blocks. As she switches on the lamp, the whiteness vanishes and a deep terracotta red and many, many greens cover all the white surfaces. The deep red earth and the lush green, thick leaves and trees envelop the space and her. The texture of the earth dapples across her face and skin. The movement of the leaves and trees animate the dense pattern on her lesu. She reaches for the jar and opens it. She dips 2 fingers in and scoops out a hard, cream-colored substance. She rubs it between her hands, the warmth of her hands melting the hardened butter. It is work, and it takes time. When it is soft, she loosens the lesu and starts to work the butter into her skin. The sound of voices start to fill the space. They speak of many things in many tongues, of pleasure and of joy, of slowness, of land and memory and family. She continues until her whole body is moisturized and her heart is no longer thirsty.
Emma, over to you.
Love that. So I was just giving space for that to settle. Thank you so much for sharing that. Actually, almost made me change what I was going to share. And I was like, no, let me not make it hard for everyone else. Thanks so much for sharing. That was beautiful. I guess in contrast, I wanted to kind of share some of the, I guess, bits that were research that inspired a piece of work that I did for The World Reimagined, which was a walking trail across the country, certainly using arts to engage people around how to reimagine not just the past, but also the future in regards to the transatlantic slave trade and how we learn from it and how can the arts play a vital role in terms of how we discuss and share and think beyond that. And in which I created a globe design that was called Amazing Grace, the courageous untold stories of African environmental heroes and sovereignty guardians. There might be a link that gets shared at some point which shows me talking a bit more about it. But one of the research, I'm going to share 2 bits of research excerpts that really inspired me, including the first one being by a Nigerian academic called Rose N. Uchum, in a research paper called Overcoming Women's Subordination in the Igbo African Culture and the Catholic Church, envisioning an inclusive theology with reference to women from Nigeria. Quite a lengthy title, and in which she says, and talks about how at the start of the Women's War, which began in 1929 in Igbo land, Colonizers saw Igbo land specifically as an extreme expression of femininity. It was seen as an untamed feminine society and therefore in desperate need of masculine rule to restore balance. And Rose goes on to explain that this fiery strength of these women to the erosion of their rights conclusively showed not only that women had political roles and rights in pre-colonial times, but also that the political institutions through which they claimed these rights were integral parts of the political tradition in Igbo land and Ibibo land. It also showed their political acumen, foresight and vision, and revealed the existence of a powerful, highly efficient political structure with networks that transcended ethnic boundaries. And the next I wanted to share also was about Queen Amarinis of Kush. Some people may or may not have heard of her, but it's predominantly known as an African kingdom that kind of took on Rome and won. And so despite losing an eye during the 5 years of battle against Kush and Rome, Queen Amarinis, who reigned around 40 to 10 BC, during this battle, had chosen to kind of take the advantage they had over the Romans, considering that they were localized near, not too far from Egypt, so in quite a deserty landscape, and use the climate to their advantage, and ultimately was part of the kind of reason why they kind of were tilted towards victory. But during this battle, she later went on to present about a dozen golden arrows as a token of peace and friendship to the Romans. But yet, if they wanted war, she urged them to keep it, that they'll need it. And kind of this fearlessness that she had in terms of preserving peace ended up forming a treaty with the Romans that, despite against all odds in their size, whilst she reigned for the rest of her time, meant that they kind of didn't have any invasions from them specifically around that time. And I guess the reason I wanted to share that is that we often hear about and talk about, you know, environmental heroes or people, especially in a more like recent sense, or even look at those we have presently in the future, which I think is so valuable. But I really find it so inspiring when you start to kind of see who are the ancestors from the past who've been doing this work around protecting our sovereignty. What does that mean to almost pay homage to, but also to recognize that we come from a great lineage of incredible, powerful people, and especially powerful women. And I'm particularly interested in how we almost continue to learn that and share those stories, so we continue to see our context as being more than colonization, and to believe that our potential is always going to be more than that also. So yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I hope there is an extensive, I would imagine there's an extensive more research that, documents that, if, you know, feel free to share that, you know, with us. Thank you for that. I love the fact that all of the work that we're doing, it's at the base of that. Research is at the base of it. And I think for me, that's where I see the role of research is that whatever that we're doing, we're bringing in so much knowledge into that, and then using our art to really, you know, to deliver that or disseminate that, whatever term we want to use. Thanks, Anna Maria, for that beautiful, the picture is so vivid, it's really beautiful. I guess my question first to you, Anna Maria, what was the inspiration for that?
So the piece was what I read today was a description of the physical piece that I performed, and it really was about trying to find like a deep sort of beauty and a deep joy in ritual, in everyday ritual and everyday practice and everyday care, and thinking about the body, or my body, as land, as something that needs to be worked and nourished and fed, and also kind of in this sort of bigger thing that I'm looking for in terms of like seeking joy and seeking kind of care, thinking about like, where are those moments that happen every day? Where are those moments that these rituals and things that I've been passed on, that have been passed on to me, like, you know, being, caring for our skin, using natural products for our skin, something that is so everyday, that is not even a thing for, for Black people, the idea of moisturizing our skin, but thinking about like what happens when we really expand that moment, what happens when we really kind of lean into the depths and the ritual of that, and what that means and what that could look like in terms of an ethos of a way of being, and wanting to like luxuriate in that and expand that. So that's kind of where the idea came from, and this sort of, this interrogation of like what it is to find like Black joy, and where, and all the different places that might be, even in those tiny moments of, looking after your skin, preparing a cup of tea. That's kind of where it came from. And then, the idea of creating that text for today was about, still wanting to kind of find space, and still wanting to use this space as a creative space to be like, okay, I could share a video excerpt of what happened, but what is it to kind of rework something? Can it be live again, and for it to be a creative process again, rather than sharing something else? So a bit of an experiment.
No, this is great, because you're bringing in a lot of ideas around moments of joy, and I know we talked about that. Yes, so we're going to talk more about that hopefully in a sec, but also the bigger piece around understanding our connection to the land, the body connection to the land, and identity, and all of those issues that are connected to climate issues. Because part of what we've learned over we've been telling ourselves over the past few episodes is they need to think of all these things as connected. It's not just isolated. And that will bring me to Emma. I know you're very interested in a lot of pre-colonial history around particularly, what I would call like re-historicizing, bringing back some of those forgotten heroes or heroines, figures that have really been in this space. I wonder if you want to share more about this research that you just shared with us now, and its connection to the discourse today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess for me, it's always been about, and I also think from a personal level, the draw to understand the history, I guess for me, has always been wanting to think beyond what we've been told. I think there's a real, when you start to do more of this work, you start to really understand that the history that we know or have been kind of like fed growing up isn't actually the full picture. And it's ultimately, it's kind of led to this real desire to kind of unpack and discover a variety of like past, but also to kind of reimagine and inform what does it mean to then innovate the future. And I feel like without being able to understand almost what the potential of the past kind of has led to us, I think it's really hard to kind of be able to really think about that in a very like strategic way, or even to give appreciation of where we're at. I find it really hard myself to kind of, people talk, and I think you kind of touched on this a little bit as well, Anna, is that there's a lot of stuff that, traditionally and even Indigenous communities have been doing for such a long, extreme amounts of time, that actually there's so much wisdom that I think through the diaspora we've also lost, from people being displaced, from people going through migration. And I'm really interested in that. How do you almost tap into that when you're thinking about how to address climate action? Like you said as well, I think there's a real onus and understand that all of it's connected to social justice, reparative justice. These are all valuable elements that kind of all feed into each other. And I almost feel like you can't really think about how to do justice to our present or the future without understanding kind of what has happened in the past. And I mean, for me, in terms of just like kind of more information around that, I think one thing that really, one particular fact that really kind of shook me in terms of really reimagining how I even see the link with reparative justice, was considering that, like, finding out that up until 1882, like more than half of the world's cumulative emissions were attributed to the UK alone, and in which that by 1950, which again, that was what, only 73 years ago, and these are people's lifetimes still, that more than half of the historical cumulative emissions of CO2 were emitted by Europe, in which the UK was still the vast majority of these emissions. And so when we look at data now, which says that the UK, for example, is like responsible for 5 to 6%, when you know those historical emissions, it really makes you kind of rethink how you kind of think about onus and responsibility, and how you kind of rethink what it means to kind of meet global climate resilience, because it's like it really starts to put a more of a clearer picture in terms of action and who should be kind of centered, but also who could be doing more. And it just really reframes that. And I think for me, when you bring it all to storytelling and communication, I feel like you talk about, we talk about kind of solutions, we talk about what's possible, but I think if we're not including those who are not only just on the front lines, but also those who inherently are the people who are still almost living the more sustainable practices, who in of itself are kind of being forced down this route to kind of follow what I guess what we could call is like, through all of our industrialization, you can't really blame certain developing countries for doing and following the footsteps of the colonizers before them. It's almost like the understanding of that we've almost created a lot of this pathway that then we're almost critiquing people with a very entitled Western lens, instead of understanding actually that we've kind of laid the foundations for a lot of what we're seeing happening in this world right now. And it's also understand like what's our responsibility. I say ours, the Western world's responsibility, and understanding what does that look like to address that. What does that look like to think radically about, platform in Africa and the global South in that way, and the power of participatory play in connection, in almost decolonizing green spaces and kind of reconnecting quite often marginalized communities back to their kind of, I don't know, not just their own heritage, but also the kind of connections to the land and what that means in a very tangible way. So I can talk about this for ages, I'll pause there, but yeah, lots of bits I think history informs, but also exciting for really looking about what we can do.
Interesting. Both of you are interdisciplinary artists, and something that you've offered us today is the idea of storytelling itself. And Anna Maria, your excerpt, and Emma, you're sort of giving us a taste of the background to your own piece. And in connection to our topic today, which is responses to climate crisis and emergency stories from the performing arts. Now, if I am to reword that title, I will reword it differently. I feel like it's still very fear given, rather than taking fear away, because we also don't want to just focus on the negatives. It's crises, it's emergencies. I rather want to say what are the stories around not just only climate emergencies and crises, but also what are those mitigation practices, right? This is me critiquing myself with the topic. But I wanted to go back to the power of storytelling. In your work, what are the stories that what's the idea? What are the ideas informing the kind of story you're telling? And how are you using storytelling to push forward those responses? And both of you really sit in an interesting position, because you're, Anna Maria, you're from Uganda. You rightly mentioned that earlier on, or maybe I knew that based on our previous conversation. And Emma, you're from Nigeria, and you're in the UK. And so your connection to your roots, R-O-O-T, and also your roots, R-O-U-T-E. It's really interesting. I'd love to hear. So first, I think the first question is, what are the ideas, or maybe those ideas that are kind of shaping, informing the stories you tell? And the second part of that is, how are you using storytelling to show forth some of these ideas around climate, not just only climate crisis, but what are also practices that we have been doing or we continue to do that are also mitigating those crises in some ways?
I think I would start by saying there's, for me, like the storytelling is about feeling and being, and seeing as well, and trying to kind of heal this thing, or this very Western individual kind of mindset that we are outside of nature, that there is a climate crisis, or there's a planetary crisis, which is, of course, we are in crisis because we are of nature, we are of the climate, and so there is this real sort of disconnect in individualism. And something that I find when I think of my connection to Uganda and my connection to my culture is more of a we culture, more of an us culture, more of community. And I think through my art practice, I really struggle with like sort of British theatre in a way, in the sense of the sort of hierarchical, very capitalist, very extractist, very inhumane way of telling stories, even though it's an industry around humanity. The structure of how that works is was very inhumane. And so the interdisciplinary nature of my practice now is about trying to kind of find what are the other ways to tell story, what are the other ways to create community, to be able to have spaces for intergenerational conversation and sharing, thinking about like the story. Yes, the story is the performance, but the story is also the process. The story is how we gather. The story is how we have space for our elders to bring in history, and then also space for the younger generation to kind of like challenge and push back. And something that I've been doing in the town that I live in St. Leonard's is there's a real kind of movement about within the diaspora here about creating community, and that looks like food, that looks like gathering, that looks like storytelling, that's performance, and there is, I suppose there's a freedom in the interdisciplinary space where there are no rules, because it's like there are, the rules aren't so strict, where you can find ways to bring in all of these elements. And so for me, it's about how do we create spaces where people can be soft, where people can feel, where people can embody, and be active rather than passive watchers of stories. And I think that has to be so holistic. It's beyond just the work of me telling a particular story. It's like, how do I prepare the community for that story? How are you involved in the idea of that story coming to fruition? What is the space that I'm inviting you in? How do I invite you in? What do you see? What do you smell? What do I offer you to taste? Like, how do we holistically, and then an audience is ready to embody, they're ready to be with, they're ready to feel, to let go of some of the kind of walls that we hold on to, especially here in the UK, and especially when you're part of the diaspora, that allow you to kind of survive, right, and not be completely wounded at every moment. And so there's a softness that happens that allows you to see, and then when you can see and you can heal yourself and each other, as nature is also part of that and the climate is also part of that, then we can start to also bring in our connection to the land and connection to the earth, and take away the separation. So for me, in the storytelling, it's kind of world community space building, and that needs to happen for then the story to be able to be present. Like, the story can't happen if the space isn't if the space hasn't been curated to hold the story and to hold people, enable them to like relax or soften, to feel the story, or to let it kind of permeate them. So I don't know if I kind of went off on a bit of a tangent, but it feels there's something about that practice to me that will allow and help communities and audiences be able to kind of to kind of engage with, like, some of the horrors of the and where we are as a people and as a planet.
That's beautiful. So I honestly just feel so inspired even just hearing that, because I think there's so much synergy of also, I guess, how I also approach it in many ways. And I think it's so nice because it's ultimately, for me, it's the idea that, storytelling is one of the most impactful ways in which you can connect to people's hearts and minds, and not just for a way of purpose, but just a very specificness of just being human. I think, we see that historically in terms of how we use griots and those who kind of have always been storytellers or kind of following tradition and history. And I think for me, it's been always about kind of connecting people, but doing so by meeting people from where they're at. I think often when you look at kind of the reality is, the mass case of people is that people are so disconnected for so many very real reasons that are very kind of human driven, through the fact we live in a capitalistic society, looking at the kind of being super time poor, even just the access or a lack of access to green spaces in and of itself, or seeing them kind of, kind of be less protected. And I think for me, how I almost approach it is understanding that I love to do these participatory engagement, which I'll talk about in a minute, about how I go about it. But I do so with the hopes that actually you're helping people build their own first-hand personal connections with and values through decolonizing their connections to nature in that way, in the hopes that they eventually get to a position where they then are able to build that desire to protect it. And what that looks like for themselves and their community can really vary. And I think ultimately it's that value that you have to kind of understand, like, what have been the stories we have been told, like what are those stories? And I think actually, and I mentioned this yesterday historically, but I want to find a broken record about the history, but it's just so interesting. But like historically as well, though, like I feel like, when you look at people, a lot of migration, especially around places like the UK, in like the last century, in 20th and 21st century, you're getting these people coming over who historically all these green spaces were very elitist, not being allowed physically to even go there or to like physically enjoy these spaces, let alone even go there naturally. And what happens is you get generations after generations who then tell their kids that, oh no, like we can't go to these spaces, we're not allowed to go to these spaces. And even now we're in a point where actually a lot of those laws that maybe have governed those spaces before have adapted, and you actually maybe can. You actually can't, because you have this mentality that also has a barrier in itself that is learned. And I think almost you're having to kind of unlearn so much and unpackage that. And people don't have the time to just prioritize connecting to nature. So almost like, how can you use the brief moments people have in terms of entertainment and play to kind of build these little seeds of joy and rerouting people to nature in many ways, which actually no one wants to not be at peace or to not be rested. What you'll find is that people just don't often have the ability to prioritize this. And so I kind of, it's inspired a lot of the research that I started off doing a couple of years ago, which is called like Nature's a Resting Tool. And it's the idea of kind of, it particularly came out of working a disadvantaged community in like the south of Bristol, which specifically looking at coming out of COVID. What does it mean? Is it coming out of really, truly? What does that even mean? Like, as the lockdowns were stopping, what does it mean to almost try to reconnect a community using hybrid tools? And so I specifically wanted to look into how can you create these nature-inspired experiences that connect people virtually who are still at home, and also those in person. How do you almost play on that power imbalances where you're able to kind of deliver something that is kind of as engaging for those remotely as those in person. And ultimately, even how I even approach that is very much understanding that, you have all this nature-informed wisdom, but actually I love to approach access as a creative tool. I think when you look at storytelling of itself and just how you connect people, often you consider access as like a challenge, like a thing you'd add as an additional thing to kind of like fix something you think is like a bit of a stress, when actually what does it look like when you consider access as like the ground basis of how you approach idea generation and creative development? And then what does that mean when you almost approach storytelling in a way where it's super radically co-created, super radically inclusive? And what does that mean when you're building these new systems with community groups and kind of form these deeper cultural understandings? And I think for me, it's not trying to understand what does it look like when you build ethics into that. I think we are in this society that almost is at so much odds with itself in terms of, trying to get back to nature, but yet we're using tech more so than ever. And tech's kind of been a big part of us trying to rethink how we're going to escape our climate crisis as well. We're shifting towards batteries, but then we all know that has lots of social implications. And it's all these kind of dualities and kinds of when we look at innovation. I think for me, when we consider performance within that, it's almost like how, even with tech of itself, how do you incorporate ethics into tech? How do you consider that in terms of, these are very real aspects to our practices that we can't escape. We can't always, and when I say I can't escape, what I mean is that we are still of the world in many ways in terms of we're operating with many of the resources that are just available to us. And so it's understanding like, yes, we can also let things happen to us, but how do we also empower communities to take charge for themselves? And I think the beautiful way of going about this is by understanding that, you've got to meet people on that journey. And that journey of itself is more beautiful, more sweeter when you're doing so in a very co-created way. And the idea of kind of meeting people where they're at, I think, comes in a very interesting like lens when you start to consider like, what does it mean to kind of, engage people who have barriers to nature, but like also how does interactive play allow for that kind of meaningful connection? I think something that's really excited me more than anything is understanding that how can you switch on what we maybe think is ways to mobilize people as just a ways to kind of form community. How can you kind of, like what you touched on as well, like Anna, sometimes people need their physical needs met first. Sometimes they need you to provide just the food, provide that safe space for them to be able to consider and can engage with other elements, and actually that almost builds that trust, that stepping stone to allow that deep connection to whatever you are sharing and performing. And I could talk about this for ages, but I'll stop there because I'm sure you have more questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Both of you are really talking about stories of connections and relationships, stories and practices of histories, not just only of the past, the present and the history that we're making for the future. And it's really interesting where both of you are coming at this around connection and relationship. Because a lot of the time when we think about climate change, climate crisis, emergency, and all of that, it's interesting that at times we don't talk about the relationship and the connection. First, our connection to ourselves, our identity, our connection to our environment, the land, and all of those things, our connection to our histories, our connection, because it's out of all of that that practices emerge, or practices are maintained, or practices are sustained, and things like that. So I wanted to go back to the idea of stories of connection and relationship, particularly in your work. Are there specific experience or stories that this idea kind of came out for you? I know that Anna Maria, you were talking about food, for example, because if you bring people together and no consideration of food, for example, or even not thinking about how that food is sourced, right? And how can we, what are those moments or experiences of those connections and relationships for you? And for Emma, again, taking us back to the history and the current realities we find ourselves, whether, in the 19th century or now in the 21st century, whether we're right now, the diaspora and all of that, our connection, our desire, longing for, wanting to connect to where we're from and understanding the past, where those stories of connections and relationship, how does that come out for you? Again, we can start with Anna Maria. I hope my question is clear and you can form it, reshape it, whatever form that sits with you.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking, like, when we're talking about food, it's become really important. So at the moment I co-run this sort of creative community. We call it creative community dreaming space in our town, space where people can dream, and called AfriCollab, can dream and connect and experiment. And food is a really important part of that. And another project that I'm currently working on, which is called The Funnest Room in the House, which is about like the kitchens of the diaspora. And it was about going back to my kitchen that I grew up in Mill Hill in North London, and looking at it as a space of, it was my first experience of Ugandan culture. So the first time I went to Uganda was when I was 8 years old. But prior to that, the first place I really experienced like my culture and my ancestry was in the kitchen, both in terms of the food, in terms of items that were, mats that were in the space. And that for me was like, and it was also, a space for my mother to bring and hold these two places. And so this project that I'm working on at the moment, which is about recreating, is about speaking to people, speaking to different generations of the diaspora about these kitchens in the UK, about these spaces that were kind of like portals to ancestral lands and homelands, and the places where we gathered and we nurtured each other, and through food and through sort of storytelling over the time that it takes to create food as well, the time it takes to make food, and the stories that were shared, and recreating that as like an installation space, but also like moving from the reality of that into the dream space, because also a lot of those spaces aren't recorded in history. They're not, people don't photograph those spaces, so they are in our memories, they're in our conversations. And then looking at these spaces that are kind of being ripped out in the sort of in gentrification at the moment, in social mobility. A lot of these spaces are like being ripped out and are in skips and filling landfills, and thinking about what is it before these, you know, I'm trying to like grab them almost before they hit the skips, to be like, what are these artifacts? What are the histories in here? What are the stories in these spaces? And what is it to like, to change, to move, to rebuild, to kind of, to get rid of, and where are we taking them and where do they go? And so for me, that's like a piece of work that I'm kind of currently working on and thinking about in terms of like both reaching back and reaching forward, and holding story through like culture, through food, through gathering, and also at something that you were saying, Emma, about like knowing what happened before so we can kind of reshape the future. You know, being able to sort of like stop or pause for a moment, which I think is our sort of job as artists, to kind of really forensically dig into a moment, so that, as you say, sometimes it's hard for people to prioritize that. So we kind of dig into it and allow a sort of shortcut into that, into those moments. And so that's like a piece of work where I'm thinking about both this idea of material recycling, upcycling, story, culture, and also finding a way back. Like, as something we talked a bit about yesterday, is that there's a real, like, I feel like a real wound, a real disconnect from my Ugandan culture, like being here, like language wise, I don't have my I don't have my mother tongue. You know, when my parents were here, my sisters didn't speak English, and so they spoke English at home to kind of help them into the education system. And there's like these kind of umbilical cords and lines that are broken. And I feel like, for me, story and creating story is a way to kind of heal those, and with that knowledge, see who we are, see who I am, and then how I connect with the land, and then and once that connection feels complete, then there's an understanding of how then we can work towards supporting the land. But if we can't see it, if we don't feel connected to it, if it's not ours, then, you know, this sort of climate denial, like I think about where I'm sat now, like, you know, I'm lucky, but it's probably like it'll take me about 5 minutes before I could find like land that's not concrete, you know? Like we are so disconnected, and we're flooding because we are, you know, it feels there's so many layers of it. But for me, it feels like how to connect and to see who I am and who we are, and as a way into seeing my connection to the planet and to the earth, and then to see how to heal that in the way that I'm healing myself and healing those in my community.
Thank you so much, Anna Maria. I want to pass it on to you, Emma. We have 6 more minutes and we have to round up.
Oh my gosh, the time!
I know, right? It's just we're just starting. But
yeah, cool. That was beautiful. Thank you so much.
Over to you, Emma.
Thank you. I guess I'll try and be super quick. But yeah, I guess ultimately, for me, that idea comes from nature's a resting tool, what I was just talking about. The premise of some of those workshops we did kind of always started with a soundscape to almost like create a space and go on its journey. But within the kind of throughout these workshops, we go on these little mini adventures where you'll have these prompts to look for stuff in your around your area or where you are. It could be literally around your bed. If you're at home, it could be those in person, and the prompts could be like, look for something that's green and, you know, try, but it can't be a leaf, or just random stuff like that. Anyway, we come back together, and the whole point is that we start to then share these different stories and prompts, you know, our first memories in nature, start to discuss these like meaningful stories that we also have, which also kind of rehook us to what it means to be kind of thinking through our own experiences and our own first-hand values in nature, but also being to hear other people's. And I think just even seeing some responses and the way in which that would build trust across the community, across the people you're sharing the space with, was so incredibly moving. And it really reminds me in so many different ways of, like, for instance, when I growing up being in the UK, having like being here with my dad and like seeing, you know, everyone else talks about having like their parents are walking around and they can like name trees and name birds and like and different sounds, and being so like loving nature but having none of that experiences growing up. And then it was until I actually went back to Nigeria with my dad properly, and then literally seeing a whole new man and seeing how he was able to almost identify like fauna and being able to like, and you know, flora, and being able to kind of speak to all his like experiences and the nature he's seen around him, and being so incredibly knowledgeable, and seeing right like firsthand that disconnect and the values of all those wisdoms that we almost don't share. And so how do you create space within your communities for that storytelling? And I think for me the most beautiful thing is that when I do these like kind of interactions with communities and this participatory playfulness, it's all about their legacy being beyond me. And so I want to make sure that really they're forming these connections for themselves, so that when I leave, the community is still strong. And I think the particularly this working group that I worked with for this series of this artist residency was incredible. And particularly in the south of Bristol where it's based, they got an amazing plethora of green spaces. And honestly, it's genuinely quite prime real estate for developers. And so through this, they kind of formed an action group and then mobilized themselves to like lobby against developers and different kind of holding accounts to account, and like we were able to even protect a local green space near like their health park because of all the work that they've kind of were able to do together. And whilst I don't actually claim to be responsible for any of their incredible like action, what I do say is the power that can form is when you create a space for them to come together. You're almost planting these seeds, and you don't know where it's going to go and take on. But I think what for me that feels really tangible is seeing how that journey is kind of developed for them, and with that, this project's evolved in itself to kind of be as then kind of led to being like, well, okay, well, there's a real strong desire for them to connect in more meaningful ways. And I'm super aware of time, so I'm going to basically wrap up. But just to say that ultimately, it kind of has led us to this point where they want to start exploring more for themselves, like what does it mean to create this multi-sensory nature-inspired experiences where you start to really think about different ways in which we are tactile beings, and how do you almost provide a real tangible experience for those who really have a barrier to experiencing elements of the outdoors, and how to almost bring that to urban spaces, which is something I'm currently developing in R&D at the moment, so I'm super excited about. But I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Emma. Both of you, you're really, and I know that we have to wrap up, but you're really bringing out really interesting ideas that I'm hoping that folks, when they listen to this later, can pick up on all of these things, because I think that the stories of connection and relationship. Also, Anna Maria, you did talk about ways that stories can actually heal us and reconnect us to broken umbilical cord, to our root. And I think that, again, from an holistic standpoint, that's where it starts from. We have to go through ourselves that healing journey before we can even talk about healing the earth, because we are the earth, right? We're part of it. We're, whatever we want to look at that, we're part of it, right? And so I find a lot of the time the fact that we're wounded, we see the impact on the ripple effect, like Emma was saying, the ripple effect on the entire world, on globalization, on, and keep mentioning all of that, which is really interesting when we come to that again, that idea of connections, and also to start bringing out stories and practices and ideas that are not fear driven, but that are healing. All right, because I think that a lot of the time the narrative that we hear, it's about the narrative of how fear, everything is fear. It's 11 o'clock. I'd like to say thank you, both of you, for being here. Thank you for taking the time. We don't have any questions. Thank you really for sharing from your vast experience and from your wealth of knowledge. I did mention earlier on, if you have any question or you have anyone you want to do a shout out to that are doing their project or community, please feel free to reach out to us. Send it to us at events, EVENTS at sustainablepractice.org. Special thanks to HowlRound again, and to all our ASL interpreters, and to the live captioners, and of course to CSPA, CSET, and Theatre Ministry International, and deeply appreciate Anna Maria and Emma for being here today. We look forward to seeing you again next week, Wednesday, for the 5th edition. And thank you so much for being here. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.